Gothic literature loving minds of the interwebs, I'm Alexa, resident ooky spooky girly and lover of all things Gothic literature, especially Edgar Allan Poe. He's had such an incredible influence on the Gothic and horror culture that we as a society know and love to this day. And what better time to honor that than during Halloween season? Question for y'all, what's your favorite work of his? Let me know in the comments, and hey, while you're at it, feel free to guess what mine is, since I promise I'll reveal it later. And welcome to the top 5 scary true stories behind Edgar Allan Poe's horror tales. Number 5, The Fall of the House of Usher. Now if that title sounds familiar, you'd be correct. I'm not going to elaborate why, because I very much stand with the actor strike that's currently ongoing, so let's dive right into the story and the possible truth. The story begins with the unnamed narrator arriving at the house of his friend, Roderick Usher, having received a letter from him in a distant part of the country, complaining of an illness and asking for his help. As he arrives, the narrator notices a thin crack extending from the roof, down the front of the house, and into the adjacent lake. It's revealed that Roderick's twin sister, Madeline, is also ill and falls into death-like trances. The narrator is impressed with Roderick's paintings and attempts to cheer him up by reading with him and listening to his improvised musical compositions on the guitar. Roderick sings The Haunted Palace, and then tells the narrator that he believes the house he lives in to be alive, and that this sentience arises from the arrangement of the masonry and vegetation surrounding it. Further, Roderick believes that his fate is connected to the family mansion. He later informs the narrator that Madeline has died, and insists that she be entombed for 2 weeks in the family tomb located in the house before being permanently buried. The narrator helps Roderick put Madeline's body into the tomb, and realizes that Madeline's body has rosy cheeks, which hey, you know what, sometimes that happens after death. Over the next week though, both Roderick and the narrator find themselves increasingly agitated. A storm begins, and Roderick comes to the narrator's bedroom, conveniently situated directly above the house's vault in an almost hysterical state. Throwing the windows open to the storm, Roderick points out that the lake surrounding the house seems to glow in the dark, just as Roderick depicted in his paintings. But there's no lightning or other explainable source of the glow. The narrator attempts to calm Roderick, by reading aloud from a medieval romance, a novel involving a knight named Ethelred who breaks into a hermit's dwelling in an attempt to escape an approaching storm, only to find a palace of gold guarded by a dragon, along with a shining brass shield hanging on a wall. So this, knight swings his mace at the dragon, which dies with a piercing shriek. When he attempts to take the shield from the wall, it falls to the floor with an unnerving clatter. As the narrator reads of the knight's forcible entry into the dwelling, he and Roderick hear cracking and ripping sounds from somewhere in the house. When the dragon's death cries are described, a real shriek is heard, again, within the house. As he relates the shield falling from the wall, a hollow metallic reverberation can be heard throughout the house. At first, the narrator ignores the noises, but Roderick becomes increasingly hysterical and declares that he has been hearing these sounds for days, and that they are being made by his sister, who was apparently alive when she was entombed. The bedroom door is then blown open to reveal Madeline, covered in red from her escape from the tomb. In a final fit of rage, she attacks her brother, scaring him to death as she herself expires. The narrator then runs from the house, and as he does, notices a flash of moonlight behind him. He turns back to see the moon shining through the suddenly widened crack in the house. As he watches, the house of Usher splits in two, and the fragments sink away into the lake. Poe's inspiration for the insane Usher twins might have actually been 2 real-life Usher twins, James Campbell Usher and Agnes Pye Usher. They were the offspring of Luke Noble Usher, an actor who performed with and was a close friend of Poe's actress mother, Eliza. Much as in the story, the real Usher twins are believed to have gone insane. Number 4, Berenice. So Poe's first horror story is the tale of a man so obsessed with his late wife's teeth that he digs up her grave to retrieve them. It was first published in the Southern Literary Messenger in 1835. The story is narrated by Aegeus, I couldn't really find a pronunciation, so we're gonna call him E, who is preparing to marry his cousin Berenice. We'll call her B. He tends to fall into periods of intense focus, during which he seems to separate himself from the outside world. B begins to deteriorate from an unnamed disease until only her teeth remain healthy. E obsesses over them, and when B is buried, he continues to contemplate her teeth. One day, he awakens with an uneasy feeling from a trance-like state and hears screams. A servant reports that B's grave has been disturbed, and she's still alive. Besides E was a shovel, a poem about visiting the grave of my beloved, and a box containing 32 teeth. Yep, he was so fixated on extracting the teeth that he didn't notice the screams of his wife, who, turns out, had been accidentally buried alive. Now, contemporary readers were horrified by the story's violence and complained to the editor of the Messenger. The grisly subject might have been inspired by actual events. So Poe was living in Baltimore when a February 23rd, 1883 article in the Baltimore Saturday Visitor reported that grave robbers had been caught stealing the teeth of corpses for dentures. 2 years later, when he published, this story, Poe told his editor the story originated in a bet that I could produce nothing effective on a subject so singular, provided I treated it seriously. I guess that was this story. Number 3. The Pit and the Pendulum. So in this story, an unnamed narrator barely survives a whole lot of torment that comes courtesy of the Spanish Inquisition. When Poe wrote the story in 1842, his readers would likely remember, the recent reports of the atrocities committed by the Inquisition, which had been abolished just 8 years earlier. Those accused of heresy could be punished until they confessed. If they, refused to confess, they could be punished to death, or if found guilty, imprisoned or burned at the stake. No big. In 1478, Spain's rulers, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, united Spain by removing all non-Catholics and asked the Pope's permission to begin the Spanish Inquisition to purify the people of Spain. Because the Spanish Inquisition was run by the king instead of by the church, it battled not only the, heretics, but also the king's political rivals. The Inquisition also became a source of income for the king, because the government confiscated the property of the condemned. Go figure. The French had entered Spain in 1808, briefly suppressing the Spanish Inquisition, and several published accounts revealed the horrors they found. Thomas Dick's 1825 book, The Philosophy of Religion, reported that on the entry of the French into Toledo, General La Salle visited the palace of the Inquisition. The great number of instruments of torment, especially the instruments to, stretch the limbs and drop baths, which cause a lingering death, excited horror, even in the minds of soldiers hardened in the field of battle. Poe was familiar with this work, and it is very easy to imagine how history might have inspired his tale, even if Poe did embellish history by inventing a punishment chamber with moving walls, a swinging pendulum blade, and a bottomless pit. Gee, I wonder what pulled inspiration from that. Anybody remember The Princess Bride? Number 2. The Telltale Heart. Out of all of Edgar Allan Poe's works, this is probably the one that's had the most influence on my life. So if you guess this one was my favorite, you'd be correct. I vividly remember back in grade 9, my high school had like a Halloween-themed arts night, and one of the older students did a dramatic one-man performance of it, and I was truly mesmerized. Also, my favorite band of all time, Mariana Trench, has an entire album that draws inspiration from like Poe's work and ghosty stuff. I absolutely recommend listening to Phantoms if you haven't already, especially Echoes of You, since it was clearly inspired by this tale. Pardon me, I should probably tell the story now. I get sidetracked a lot. It's easy. ADHD's fun. An unnamed narrator is driven to killings by the sight of an old man's hideous eye. Although he has supersonic hearing, the narrator repeatedly assures the reader that he's not mad, and as evidence, tells us how calmly and methodically he can tell the tale until he starts hearing the dead victim's heart beating from its hiding place under the floorboards. Now, different real-life killers have been cited as the inspiration for Poe's tale. Among them is the 1830 killing of Joseph White of Salem, Massachusetts. The special prosecutor on the case, Daniel Webster, published his argument on the trial as a pamphlet. In the text, he writes that the killer's guilt will eventually reveal itself, and that the secret which the killer possesses soon comes to possess him, it overwhelms him. He feels it beating at his heart, rising to his throat, and demanding disclosure. He thinks the whole world sees it in its face, reads it in his eyes, and almost hears its working in the very silence of his thoughts. It has become his master. Another possible source is the 1840 trial of James Wood for the death of his daughter. Wood pled that he wasn't guilty, by reason of insanity. So the question, put to the jury was whether or not Wood was mad. The reporter covering the trial stated that, although Wood's calm demeanor might lead some to believe him as a premeditated contract killer rather than a madman, he believes this calmness is merely the cunning of the maniac. A cunning which baffles that of the wisest man of sound mind, the amazing self-possession with which at times, he assumes the demeanor, and preserves the appearance of perfect sanity. The jury in the case ruled in Wood's favor and sent him to an asylum. Oh, that messenger reporter? None other than Edgar Allan Poe himself. Number 1. The Masque of the Red Death. So in Poe's story, a plague known as the Red Death is sweeping the land, causing the peasantry to spring redness from their pores and suffer an agonizing death. To escape the epidemic, Prince Prospero locks himself and his noble friends in his eccentrically decorated abbey for a masquerade ball. Later in the evening, an uninvited guest arrives, dripping in red bodily fluids and dressed in the, outfits of the grave, if you will. When he tries to expel the party crasher, redness gushes from Prospero's face, revealing that he has been stricken with the Red Death. The other guests seize the intruder, only to discover there's no one inside the costume. So just 10 years before he wrote the story, Poe survived the cholera epidemic of 1832. Unlike the Red Death, however, the symptoms of this one included severe diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration, followed by, death. Terrified citizens fled cities to escape what many considered an urban disease, disproportionately affecting the urban poor, the sinful, and the intemperate. Poe was living in Baltimore, a city of over 80,000 people, where cholera claimed 853 of the city's residents between August and November of 1832. Back in Poe's hometown of Richmond, Virginia, it claimed one of his best friends, Ebenezer Burling. In the midst of all this fear and suffering, a group of 2,000 Parisians decided to celebrate what seemed to be the end of the world by throwing a masquerade ball. At the stroke of midnight, one of the guests arrived dressed as the personification of cholera, with skeletal armor and bloodshot eyes. An account of the party appeared in the June 2nd, 1832 issue of the New York Mirror, where Poe probably saw it. This story went on to inspire elements of one of the most famous musicals of all time, and a personal favorite, The Phantom of the Opera. During Act 2, the Opera House hosts a masquerade ball. The Phantom, who has been conspicuously absent since the chandelier disaster of the previous act, appears in costume as the Red Death to announce that he has written an opera entitled Don Juan Triumphant, and demands that it be produced with his love, Christine, in the lead role. He pulls Christine's engagement ring from the chain around her neck and vanishes in a flash of light. Time to watch the 25th anniversary DVD again tonight, I think. And sadly, that brings us to the end of our time, but let me know in the comments if you want a part 2, since there's so many more stories that should be told. If you enjoyed my ramblings today, could you help us out by giving this video a like, subscribing if you aren't already, hit the bell for more gothic goodies from us here at Top 5 Scary Videos, and I'll see y'all next time, you lovely spooky people.